1969. A secret report lands on a desk at the Pentagon, and the general's jaws literally drop. The numbers they see are impossible. They contradict everything the American war machine believes in. 73 men in faded uniforms are posting results that 200,000 American soldiers with $1 billion budget cannot even come close to replicating. What does the Pentagon do? It classifies the document, buries it in the archives, and pretends that nothing happened. But I dug up this story, and today you will learn the truth that American generals hid for 50 years. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, ghosts of the jungle. American special forces, who had seen it all, watched their methods with open mouths, and one intelligence major wrote a phrase that became legendary. "We are soldiers, they are predators. These are different professions." Who are these people? How did farmers and surfers from Australia turn into the deadliest hunters of that war? Why did the Pentagon fly into a rage at the comparison with them? And what lesson did America fail to learn, paying for it with tens of thousands of lives? Watch until the end, because what you are about to hear will overturn everything you knew about Vietnam. 1969, Phuoc Thi Province, South Vietnam. An American major from the Massey V Intelligence Directorate arrives at the Nui Dat base with a secret assignment to find out why the Australian Special Forces are demonstrating kill rates that exceed the results of the best American units by tenfold. In his briefcase is a folder marked "For Official Use Only," containing statistics the Pentagon would prefer never to see. The kill ratio for the Australian SAS was 50-1, whereas for the American Green Berets, it barely reached 8-1. These figures did not fit into any framework of military logic of that time. The major expected to see some secret weapon, a revolutionary tactic, or at least numerical superiority. Instead, he found 73 men in sun-bleached uniforms moving through the jungle as if they had been born among these vines and ferns. They didn't use helicopter support. They didn't call in artillery for every suspicious bush. They simply vanished into the green hell for 10, sometimes 14 days, and returned with results that left American staff officers slack-jawed. But the most shocking discovery lay ahead for the major, and it changed everything he knew about war. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, arrived in Vietnam in July 1966, and from the very first weeks, it was clear. These guys were playing by completely different rules. While Americans conducted massive search-and-destroy operations involving thousands of soldiers, hundreds of helicopters, and millions of dollars, the Australians worked in groups of 5 or 6 men. Sounds like suicide? That's exactly what American commanders thought until they saw the results. The Americans experienced their first serious shock during the Joint Operation Bribey in August 1966. 18 Australian soldiers encountered a Viet Cong unit numbering about 2,500 men. By all laws of military science, the Australians should have been wiped out within the first 15 minutes. Instead, the battle lasted 3.5 hours, and when the dust settled, over 240 enemy bodies remained on the field. The Australians lost 18 men killed and 24 wounded, but they did not retreat a single meter. American officers observing the events from the command post could not believe their eyes. How could a handful of men withstand a whole regiment? The answer didn't lie in firepower. The Australians didn't have a tenth of the arsenal possessed by an average American company. The secret was in something entirely different. However, the real differences emerged not in large battles, but in the daily work of reconnaissance patrols. And this is where what Americans would later call the phantom phenomenon began. A standard American patrol looked like this: 12 to 15 men, heavily laden with gear, moving through the jungle at a speed of about 500 meters per hour. They carried radios weighing nearly 15 kilograms. They hauled food supplies for several days. They were draped in grenades, spare magazines, and signal flares. And they made enough noise for Viet Cong observers to spot them from a kilometer away. An Australian SAS patrol was 5 men, each carrying no more than 20 kilograms of gear. No canned food, only dry rations that didn't need heating. No unnecessary talk. During 10 days in the jungle, they might exchange only a few dozen words, and only in whispers. No smoking. The enemy could smell tobacco from hundreds of meters away. They moved at a speed of 100 meters per hour, sometimes slower, checking every bush, every branch, every mark on the trail. The Viet Cong nicknamed them Ma Rung, ghosts of the jungle. And that wasn't a compliment. It was a cry of terror. But this was only the beginning of a story that made the Pentagon turn cold. In 1968, the American command initiated a secret program to exchange experience between Allied Special Forces units. The official goal was coordination of tactical procedures. The real goal was to find out what the hell the Australians were doing that the best American operators couldn't do. The first group of American observers arrived at Nui Dat Base in March of that year. Among them were veterans of Viet Cong, the elite unit conducting secret operations in Laos and Cambodia. These men had seen everything. They thought they couldn't be surprised. They were wrong. On the very first day, an Australian sergeant named Kevin Potter demonstrated the standard patrol preparation procedure. The Americans watched as he methodically cut the soles of his boots in a specific way, creating a pattern identical to the tracks of Viet Cong Ho Chi Minh sandals. Then he showed how to treat clothing and gear with a special compound made from local plants that masked the human scent. After that, he explained how Australians use Aboriginal hunter methods to read tracks in the jungle. One of the Americans, a Marine captain with 3 combat tours under his belt, later wrote in his report, "I realized that we are soldiers. They are hunters. These are completely different professions." The methods of the Australian SAS shocked the Americans not only with their efficiency, but with their brutal logic. In 1967, the Australian command quietly sanctioned a practice that historians would later call psychological terror in miniature. After successful ambushes, Australian patrols would leave enemy bodies in specific poses. They placed playing cards on the corpses featuring the Ace of Spades, a symbol of impending doom in Asian cultures. Sometimes they left notes in Vietnamese with warnings for those who found the bodies. The effect was stunning. Entire Viet Cong units refused to enter areas where the Rung were operating. American observers recorded a case where a Viet Cong battalion of over 400 men made a 12-kilometer detour through swampy terrain to bypass the area of responsibility of an Australian patrol of 6 men. 6 men forced 400 to retreat without firing a shot simply by their presence. But was this tactic the result of strategic genius or something darker? This question haunted American analysts for years. The Pentagon received the first full report on Australian SAS methods in November 1968. The 347-page document was immediately classified top secret. The reason? The report's content called into question the entire American doctrine of counterinsurgency warfare. Analysts calculated that to achieve the same results demonstrated by the Australian SAS, American forces required 15 to 20 times more personnel and 50 times more material resources. One Australian operator during a standard 12-month tour produced as many confirmed enemy kills as an entire platoon of American infantry. The numbers were so humiliating for the American military establishment that General William Westmoreland personally ordered the report's distribution be limited to a narrow circle of top officers. Public admission of Australian superiority could undermine troop morale and cause a political scandal in Washington. However, the truth has a way of leaking through any security clearance. What made the Australian operators so deadly? The answer lay in their origins and training. 2 factors the Americans couldn't replicate even if they wanted to. Most Australian SAS soldiers came from rural areas of the continent, places where hunting and tracking game were not hobbies, but a means of survival. Many of them had learned to read tracks from childhood alongside Aboriginal hunters, whose ancestors had perfected this art over 50,000 years. For them, the jungles of Vietnam were not a hostile environment, but simply another type of bush, with its own rules that could be learned and exploited. Sergeant Reg Banks, a veteran of 3 combat tours in Vietnam, later explained it this way. "The Americans tried to beat the jungle with technology. We simply became part of the jungle. These are completely different approaches." Training for Australian operators included a 6-month survival course in the Australian bush, where conditions were no less harsh than in Vietnam. They learned to eat insects and snakes, find water where there seemed to be none, and move silently through the most difficult terrain. By the time they arrived in Vietnam, each of them was already a hardened hunter. But here, the story takes an unexpected turn. In 1969, the American command attempted to integrate Australian methods into the training of Viet Cong units. The program was codenamed Project Boomerang and was scheduled for 12 months. It was led by Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, a legendary special operations commander who would later become famous for the raid on the Son Tay prison camp. The results were discouraging. American operators physically could not sustain the pace of Australian patrols. 10 days in the jungle without hot food, with almost no sleep, in a constant state of hyperconcentration, this was beyond their training. Of the first group of 24 volunteers, only 7 completed the course. Of those, only 2 received clearance to participate in live operations under Australian standards. Colonel Simons wrote a phrase in his final report that subsequently became legendary in Special Forces circles. "We train soldiers to be efficient. They train men to be predators. The difference is fundamental and, perhaps, insurmountable." The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is a story not only of tactical superiority, but of a deep cultural divide between two allies. Americans believed in firepower, technological dominance, and the massive application of force. Australians believed in patience, stealth, and precise violence. One of the most telling episodes was Operation Commando in February 1968. The American command planned a massive sweep of Phuoc Tuy province involving 2 infantry brigades, an armada of helicopters, and air support. The Australians proposed an alternative plan: allow them to conduct a series of covert ambush operations using 8 patrols, a total of 48 men. The Americans insisted on their option. The result: 3 weeks of operations, over 100 dead American soldiers, the destroyed infrastructure of 5 villages, and fewer than 70 confirmed enemy kills. Viet Cong units simply melted into the jungle at the first signs of the American advance. A month after the operation ended, the Australians executed their plan. In 2 weeks, 8 patrols killed over 130 Viet Cong, captured 3 mid-level officers, and obtained intelligence that led to the disruption of a planned enemy offensive on Saigon. Australian casualties: 2 slightly wounded. The statistics were humiliating, and the Pentagon understood this perfectly. However, the American military establishment was not ready to acknowledge the superiority of the little ally. Internal Pentagon documents from that period, declassified only in 2012, reveal the scale of institutional denial. In one memo, Army Vice Chief of Staff General Bruce Palmer wrote, "The Australians' methods are not applicable to our conditions. They work with small forces in a limited territory. Our task is control of the entire country." It was a classic excuse, and it was deeply flawed. The Australian contingent's area of responsibility covered a territory comparable to an American divisional zone, yet the Australians operated with forces equivalent to 1 reinforced battalion, and they achieved results that an American division could not replicate. But to admit this meant admitting the failure of the entire American strategy in Vietnam. And no one was ready for that. Not in the Pentagon, not in the White House. Meanwhile, on the ground in the jungles of Vietnam, the truth was obvious to anyone with eyes. American soldiers serving alongside the Australians brought home stories that sounded like military legends. The story of a 5-man Australian patrol that tracked a Viet Cong headquarters for 2 weeks, then wiped out the entire sector command in 40 seconds. The story of an SAS sniper who had over 90 confirmed kills in a single tour, without a single miss. The story of a group that lay in ambush for 6 days, motionless, eating raw snakes and rainwater, to kill a single Viet Cong courier. These stories were passed from mouth to mouth, gaining details, but their core remained unchanged. The Australians did what the Americans could not or would not do. They turned war into a hunt, and they hunted with an efficiency that bordered on something inhuman. However, behind this efficiency lay a price that people preferred not to speak of aloud. By 1970, the Australian command began to notice alarming trends among SAS veterans. Many of them had serious difficulties adapting to civilian life. Some reported intrusive memories, nightmares, an inability to be in enclosed spaces. Others admitted to feeling a strange longing for the jungle, for the feeling of the hunt, for the adrenaline of the ambush. For the moment, the enemy is in the crosshairs. Military psychologists of the time had no term to describe this condition. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not yet officially recognized. But SAS veterans described something more complex than simple combat stress. They spoke of transformation, of how the war changed them at a fundamental level, turning them from ordinary men into something else. Sergeant Harry Murphy, a veteran of 4 combat tours, said in a 1987 interview, "And yet, the legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends far beyond that war. In 1980, when the U.S. military analyzed the failure of the hostage rescue operation in Iran, one of the main conclusions was the need for a fundamental review of Special Forces training. Analysts turned to the experience of the Australian SAS, the very experience the Pentagon had rejected 15 years earlier. The result was the creation of Delta Force, the U.S. Army's elite counterterrorism unit. Its founder, Sabazi Colonel Charles Beckwith, openly admitted the influence of the Australian and British SAS on the concept of the new unit. He personally visited Australian training centers and adapted many methods that Americans had once rejected as inapplicable. The irony was cruel. Lessons that could have saved thousands of lives in Vietnam were learned only after defeat, and learned a whole decade too late. But let's return to that American major who started this story. After 3 months of observing Australian SAS operations, he wrote a report that was never officially published, A copy of the document obtained by journalists in 2015 under the Freedom of Information Act contains a stunning admission. The major wrote, "In 20 years of service, I considered myself a professional soldier. In 3 months with the Australians, I realized I was just an amateur with good equipment. These people are not soldiers in our sense of the word. They are representatives of an ancient profession that existed long before armies appeared. They are hunters of men, and they have been perfecting their craft for millennia." At the end of the report, he added a recommendation that was ignored by command. Either we learn from them, or we admit that our approach to this war is fundamentally flawed. There is no third option. The Pentagon chose the third option, to pretend the problem didn't exist, and it paid for that decision with 58,000 lives. The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam remains one of the least known chapters of that war. American textbooks barely mention the participation of allies. Hollywood movies portray the war as an exclusively American affair. The national narrative leaves no room for the admission that someone might have fought better. But numbers don't lie. 521 Australian servicemen died in Vietnam. This is a tragedy. Every life is an irreplaceable loss. However, the ratio of Australian casualties to the damage inflicted on the enemy remained unprecedented throughout the war. The Australian SAS lost 2 operators in Vietnam, 2 men in 6 years of combat operations. The number of enemies they eliminated remains a subject of debate. Estimates range from 500 to over 1,000. 2 against 1,000. This statistic should have changed everything. Instead, it was buried in secret archives. Another aspect of Australian SAS activity aroused particular interest and particular concern among American observers. This was the use of Aboriginal trackers included in the patrols. These men, representatives of peoples whose ancestors had hunted on the Australian continent for thousands of generations, brought skills to modern warfare that could not be replicated by any technological means. Private Tracker Buddy Tilmuth, an Aboriginal tracker from the Northern Territory, became a legend among the Australian contingent. He could determine how many people had walked a path, how fast they were moving, how long ago it happened, and even if they were carrying loads. He distinguished the tracks of hundreds of different people as easily as a European distinguishes faces. American officers observing his work refused to believe their eyes until his conclusions were confirmed again and again. The Viet Cong called such trackers _24. And not without reason. It was practically impossible to escape an Aboriginal hunter. He saw tracks where an ordinary person noticed nothing. He read the jungle like an open book. But this skill had a dark side. In 1968, several Aboriginal trackers refused to continue service. The reason they gave shocked the command. They said that _25_ violated the sacred laws of their people, that the spirits of their ancestors could no longer protect them, that they had lost their connection to the land. To the Western rational mind, this sounded like superstition, but for people whose culture spanned over 50,000 years of continuous history, it was a reality more tangible than any army orders. Some of them spent months in cleansing ceremonies after returning home, trying to restore their lost balance. War took not only lives, it took something deeper. Connection to roots, to the land, to ancestors. And the Australians, for all their efficiency, were not immune to this loss. By 1971, when the Australian contingent began withdrawing troops from Vietnam, the results were obvious to all who wanted to see them. The Australian SAS conducted over 1,200 patrol operations. They controlled an area of over 4,000 square kilometers with forces that never exceeded 100 men at a time. They gathered intelligence that prevented at least 3 major enemy offensives. And they did all this with casualties that could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The American contingent lost over 45,000 men killed during the same period. The difference in methods and in results was too obvious to ignore. And yet, the American command continued to ignore it until the very end. Why? This question has haunted historians for decades. Part of the answer lies in institutional pride. The American war machine was the largest and most technologically advanced in human history. To admit that 73 Australians in faded uniforms were doing what 200,000 Americans with $1 billion budget could not, that was unthinkable for generals whose careers depended on demonstrating American superiority. Part of the answer lies in cultural differences. American military doctrine was built on the concept of, quote, 26, superiority in firepower, technology, and resources. The Australian approach, patience, stealth, precise application of violence, contradicted everything American commanders believed in. But the main reason was even simpler. To admit the Australians were right meant admitting that the entire American strategy in Vietnam was flawed from the start. And no one was ready for that. Not the military, not the politicians, not society. History has a habit of repeating itself for those who do not learn its lessons. In 2001, when American troops entered Afghanistan, they faced the same problems as in Vietnam. Massive operations scattered the enemy but did not destroy him. Technological superiority did not help against an enemy who knew every path, every cave, every stone in his land. History repeated itself with frightening precision. And again, the Australian SAS demonstrated an alternative approach. Operations by Australian units in Uruzgan province became a model of efficiency. Small groups, deep reconnaissance, precision strikes. And again, the American command preferred not to notice these results. The price of unlearned lessons was measured in human lives. Thousands of lives. Tens of thousands. Today, more than half a century after the end of the Vietnam War, the legacy of the Australian SAS continues to influence the development of special operations around the world. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the British SAS, all these units have, to one degree or another, borrowed methods refined by the Australians in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The concept of Quote 27 has become the standard for modern special operations. The idea that quality is more important than quantity, that one trained operator is worth a platoon of ordinary soldiers. This idea, which Americans rejected in Vietnam, is now the foundation of all special operations doctrine. But the recognition came too late, and it came not in the form of gratitude to an ally, but in the form of quiet borrowing without citing the source. Pentagon military history textbooks continue to describe Vietnam as an American war. Perhaps the most vivid symbol of this unrecognized history was an episode that occurred in 1998. At a Special Operations Veterans Reunion at Fort Bragg, former Delta Commander Major General William Garrison gave a speech dedicated to the evolution of U.S. Special Forces. He listed dozens of operations, methods, and innovations, and never once mentioned the Australian SAS. After the speech, an elderly Australian in civilian clothes approached him, a Vietnam veteran who had arrived at the event as an invited guest. He said just one sentence, "We are glad you finally learned." Garrison, according to eyewitnesses, could find no answer. This story is not about national superiority, not about whose army is better, and certainly not about humiliating American soldiers who honestly did their duty in impossible conditions. This story is about the price of institutional blindness, about how arrogance and unwillingness to learn from others can cost thousands of lives, about how the most powerful war machine in history lost a war partly because it refused to listen to an ally who had found the right answer. The Australian SAS were not super soldiers. They were ordinary men, farmers, workers, teachers, who learned to do something extraordinary. They adapted ancient hunting skills to modern warfare. They turned patience into a weapon, stealth into armor, precision into a destructive force. And they did it so well that their enemies called them ghosts, and their allies preferred to forget their existence. In 2020, the Australian government initiated an investigation known as the Brereton Report. This document called into question some methods of the Australian SAS, not in Vietnam, but in later conflicts in Afghanistan. The findings were heavy. Allegations of unlawful conduct, violations of rules of engagement, abuse of force. For many Vietnam veterans, this report was a painful reminder that the line between efficiency and cruelty is very thin. The methods that made the SAS so deadly in Vietnam, psychological pressure on the enemy, harsh interrogations, demonstrative violence, could, in other circumstances, cross the line separating a warrior from a criminal. This does not cancel out the achievements of previous generations, but it serves as a reminder that the price of becoming a predator may turn out to be higher than anyone is willing to admit. So what remains of that era in the end? The statistics remain, which are impossible to dispute. The tactics remain, which changed modern warfare. The memory remains of those who were there and saw everything with their own eyes. And the phrase that American major remains, written over half a century ago in a secret report that the Pentagon so desperately did not want to see. We are soldiers. They are hunters. These are completely different professions. Perhaps in this simple phrase lies the key to the whole story. The war in Vietnam required hunters. America sent soldiers. Australia sent hunters. And the hunters won, in their sector, with their methods, in their own way. The Pentagon never forgave them for this superiority. But history remembers everything. The epilogue of this story continues to be written today. Every year, young Australians go through a grueling selection process for the Special Air Service Regiment. They learn the same methods their predecessors perfected in the jungles of Vietnam half a century ago. They read the same manuals, perform the same drills, undergo the same hardening. And somewhere in training centers around the world, from Fort Bragg to Hereford, Special Forces instructors tell stories about jungle ghosts who changed the history of warfare. Often they don't mention that these ghosts were Australian. Sometimes they don't even know it themselves. History has been rewritten, appropriated, dissolved into the general narrative of special operations. But those who know, remember, and pass this memory on, because some stories are too important to be forgotten, even if the authorities prefer that no one knows about them. This story began with an American major arriving at Nui Dot Base with a secret assignment. It ended with him understanding something that his superiors never could, or never wanted to accept. Superiority is not measured by the number of helicopters or the size of the budget. It is measured by results. And by this single honest criterion, the Australian SAS was the best unit of that war. The Pentagon flew into a rage at this comparison. Generals rejected the findings. Politicians ignored the recommendations. But the ghosts of the jungle knew the truth. And the truth, as is known, has a habit of surfacing, even if it takes 50 years.